In a time of limitless ambition, the Tower of Babel tore the sky with its clay. Two moons, one pale, another red, cut them at night, announcing omens ancient. In the flowerbed, voices fragmented in chaos, scaffolds collapsed, and archangels gathered to judge the fate of mortals. Divided between fear and hope, kings, priests, and slaves set out towards the desert, to the forest, and to the mountains. From the unfinished silhouette of the tower is born one saga of pride, judgment, and redemption. The sun was rising on the horizon, tinting golden the remaining waters of the great flood that until recently had covered all the earth. When the flood finally receded, revealing valleys and flood-free plains, appeared before the survivors' unreal scenario. The vast plain of Babel stretched like a green carpet between rushing rivers. The soil, loaded with fertile sediments, exhaled sweet aroma of renewed life. Here, where the submerged world once lay, rose now soft clay plates and hills soft, sprinkled of clear water puddles that reflected the celestial immensity. The survivors of the flood, descendants of Noah and his sons, arrived in scattered groups, exhausted by the crossing of the waters. Men and women, children and elders, each carrying on their skin the residue of salt and the mud, they raised temporary camps, temporary by the rivers. They set up tents made of skins and branches, while some more skilled, guided by the instinct of survival, dug shallow channels to divert the water to makeshift gardens. It was work collective. Some were cutting wood from the nearby forests, others digging trenches for planting seeds collected in a hurry. Gathered around bonfires at dusk night, the elders told stories of the flood, tales of strange animals that emerged from beneath the waters, of thunder that shook the firmament, of damaged chests that fought against merciless currents. Each narrative reinforced the bond between those villagers. They were brothers for having shared the same danger, and now they were united the low tide, which had returned the land to its your feet. There was one reverence silent for the water that saved some and took others. The belief in the strength of Noah and of his descendants gained contours of a founding myth. Meanwhile, the councils of elders began to form. In each village, circle of leaders defined the rules of coexistence: where to plant, when to harvest, how to distribute the surplus of food. They also decided the watch shift within the limits of the camp, protecting the children and the crops from beasts wild that, attracted by the abundant sudden, crawled of the nearby woods. The cooperation was the lifeline. Only by joining efforts could they consolidate a new way of life. The climate of Babel alternated between days of scorching sun and moderate rains, without the chaos of storms overwhelming that typified the months of the flood. The land, now revitalized, yielded sources of medicinal herbs, sage, thyme, and lavender that were harvested to treat wounds and fevers occasional. At each dawn, the peasants examined with pride their fields. The fertile soil overflowed with the promise of abundance, and the water flowed in obedient channels, indication that at last they could tame that which once seemed stronger than hope itself. In the center of each village, a small square of stones set in the mud, where the assemblies were held. There, on full moon nights, magistrates improvised pronounced decisions of general interest: construction of new mill, tool exchange, delimitation of territories for grazing. Amid these meetings, the first concerns arose. Until when would they live in the simplicity of the huts? And if there were one way to demonstrate to the world, or the gods, that the humanity was reborn, not only in quantity, but in greatness. Before the sun reaches the zenith, the villages converge to the central square of Babel. The first tents rose like flower petals in the unfolding of the day. Men, women, and children brought with them objects of esteem: painted clay bowls, reed flutes, and colorful blankets. The air 3 times breathed was one of expectation. Today, it would be the great party that would seal the unique voice of humanity, united by survival and by a language that no one dared to forget. At dusk, the bonfires were lit. Circulars, huts, and tents were arranged around the gentle warmth of the flames. Storyteller rose above a sunken trunk in the earth. His eyes sparkled while he recited ancient proverbs and legends that unified the memory of the clans. It was an oral performance. Each sentence included gestures and meditative silences, allowing everyone, from elders to children, understood the deeper meaning of the words. Hours later, the rumor of one idea began to grow among the corners, and if were possible to raise something as strong as the conviction of your unique language, the doubt spread like a spark from a bonfire, The existence fleeting nature of man needed to be marked in something that would remain beyond the blowing of the wind and the step of generations. This thought, anti-whispered, became increasingly audible among dances and chants. The centralizing king, wearing the embroidered cloak with symbols of the flood, approached the bard and the artisans. With a firm voice, asked the poet-architect to step up to the podium, improvised. The poet, who kept in the letters the fervor of his natal trees, spoke of the raw material, clay, wood, stone. He explained that the monument could be born right there, rising on the fertile soil and drinking from the strength rivers, just as the party drank from the hearts. The audience, intoxicated by the music and by the date wine, raised in unison. There were applause and cheers, voices acclaiming the greatness that could arise from united hands. Some hesitated, fearing that ambition could attract the severe gaze of the heavens. But others, young and vigorous, already envisioned walls that touched the sky, stone ramps and circular towers reflecting the light of the setting sun. Amidst the clamor, Old Elder raised one gourd of clay filled of barley seeds. "We will plant our hope in each brick," shouted, the voice echoing like contained thunder. The seeds, he said, would germinate not only in the soil, but in the memory of those who passed through the work. One promise of life and continuity. Each newborn would know early on the strength that the community could exert on the matter raw. The flames of the bonfires became amber coals, and the illuminated faces reflected the courage of those who dared to dream big. The square transformed into a hymn of unity, marking the moment when the unique voice of the humanity, before only music and tales, became project, in work that would begin at the next dawn. When the moon reached the point highest, the procession ended in solemn chant. Each villager returned to his home with the heart inflamed with purpose, to raise something that would be a witness of its time, beacon that would cross generations and told in silent petriel the epic of a people that found itself after the waters recede. And so, in the morning that would come, would begin the planting of stones and of dreams, hard but promising seeds, shapes in the language that, even then, vibrated in unison. Before the hen's crowing announces the new day, the tent reel was rising at the eastern edge of the square, immersed in aromas of incense and cedar. There, King Anuk, centralizing, called for his ambition to unify all the tribes under the same scepter, adjusted himself in his alabaster seat, wore the embroidered tunic with lines of gold that formed the waters of the defeated flood, symbol of his power over land and sea. Around you, counselors, the General Buran, the High Priest Elias and a scribe Meret, were waiting your orders, eyes shining with expectation. With a firm voice, Anuk started the session. The force that brought us here is not just the water that has withdrew, but the word that remains. Today we do not raise just bricks, we raise our legacy. Buran, the warrior with broad shoulders, furrowed his brow. Majesty, our guard needs to patrol the borders. Rival tribes look at Babel with envy. By the way, the priest raised the sacred staff. And God? If our ambition sounds like arrogance, they can punish us with new catastrophes. Meret, in turn, tiles scrolls with calculations of resources and schedules. We need 2 months to gather clay and wood. Without clear deadlines, the project falls apart. As the debate heated up, the tent door swung open to reveal Princess Astar, daughter of the High Priest Elias. His sky blue tunic, sky blue, displayed geometric symbols, perfect triangles, concentric circles and lines that suggested water chains. Astar, recognized as an engineer by the temples of Babel, brought in hand a scroll of papyrus with detailed plans of foundations, irrigation channels and reservoirs underground. By your side, with calm steps and eyes full of various Umbra, the poet-architect, carried clay plates engraved with stanzas that spoke of the union of stone and the word. Umbra was born in the village of Haran, son of potter who shaped vessels in gentle fire. Since childhood, scribbled poems in the still damp clay, enchanting the travelers passing by. Had learned geometry by observing the curves of the father's jars, deciphering angles and proportions. Grew up believing that poetry was a path to transcendence, and that each symbol engraved on a wall could be more enduring than 1,000 words whispered to the wind. It was his fame as a bard of the foundations that brought him to the king's ears. A Princess Astar, for her part, had grown up among chants of temple and spring secrets. He will learn from the scribes to read the stars, and with the farmers to measure the flow of the waters. Drew underground maps of ancient rivers and catalogued types of clay according to granulation. I swore that, when articulating stone expenses and water conduits, could create a living monument, well of life in the center of Babel, able to nourish the soil and elevate the soul of those who approached. The first meeting between the poet-architect and the engineer-princess, it happened on a dawn and foggy. Amram had arrived at the temple of Elias to offer song written on clay tablets. Astar, curious, requested one replica on papyrus. They found themselves under the painted arch with constellations, exchanging ideas about the meter of the stanzas and the tension of the pillars. She proposed to adjust the lines of the poem to that formed a diagram structural, and he agreed to add syllables that reflected the flow of water. A sacred partnership was born there, one sacred. With the approval of Anuk, began to work side by side. In a flower bed improvised, Astar hated the resistance of new clays, while Amram recorded epic verses on vertical bricks. They discussed for hours the position of each block, seeking to align the building with the stars that signaled the promise of safe heaven. In the pauses, shared bread with dates and caressed their own muddy hands, signatory silent of his collaboration. The king, satisfied, designated the two to the leadership of the magistrates of the construction. In a public assembly, Astara presented the layout of the foundation, and Amram recited prologue in free verse, praising the alliance between king and people. The people applauded, glimpsing in their presence one grand image, the pride of the princess and the passion of the poet, condensed in the same work. Some murmured that that duo could raise not only stones, but the human spirit. Even so, behind the scenes, Buran warned of internal rivals. If these two continue gaining prestige, we run the risk of seeing palaces and temples sink into envy. Meret, always cautious, noted every word, preparing reports for the royal treasury. Moreover, out of fear of offending his daughter, he remained in silence but did not cease to invoke blessings upon the alliance of ingenuity and verse. Anuk closed the session, declaring, "Next dawn of the new moon we will launch the first brick, that it be said to the children of our children that, when the waters receded, was born not a king nor isolated poet, but united people by the vision of these leaders." At the end, Aster and Umbra exchanged glances of complicity, no longer just engineer and poet, but guardians of a dream greater than their own ambitions. Thus was established the trio that would lead to Epic of Babel, king driven by the power to consolidate kingdoms, Foon engineer princess, able to translate the fluidity of the waters into solid structures, and architect poet that saw in the monument immortal verse. Minutes later, the white doves took flight over the tent reel, carrying in the wind the omen of one work that swore to break the boundaries of the possible. On the night when the moon hid behind restless clouds, the Princess Astar felt a call that echoed in her bones. Guided by omens and by the maternal advice that spoke of domains sacred, she left the comfort of her tent and went to the ancestral temple, erected by the very descendants of 100 shortly after the flood. The sand-colored columns, partially covered by era and lichens, projected elongated shadows on the mosaic floor, cracked. Heavy silence reigned among the broken statues of ancient deities, silent witnesses of faith that men tried raise as high as the firmament. Astar advanced through corridors, illuminated by torches arranged in niches of stone rustic. The smell of burnt oil mixed with the slightly acidic odor of time accumulated in each crack. To bottom, the echo of your own feet stepping the mosaic sounded like a war drum. In the central altar, one bronze cup still held remnants of wine and honey. Forgotten offering of a ritual long concluded. She settled down in front of the cup, touched the polished blade of the pedestal, and leaned in silent prayer, asking for a sign to realize the great dream, reach the top of the sky with the tower imagined. Without warning, the space trembled for a moment. The princess lost the balance, let go sigh, and everything calmed down. Then the air became thick, and one mist bluish rose from the ground, wrapping around his ankles. One distant voice, almost whisper, called by his name. Astar trembled, but did not retreat. The mist took shape and projected against the wall. Light traces outlined one colossal tower. Spiral ramps rose towards the star-filled sky. It was such a vivid vision that she could feel the vibration of the stone blocks, the heat of the furnaces that burned them, and the echo of hammers working incessantly. In the ethereal projection, saw legions of workers bringing bricks arranged like verses of a great architectural poem, primitive elevators, made of ropes and pulleys, hoisted sculptures and living reliefs, depicting the crossing of Noah by flood. Along the edges, plants and vines intertwined, creating hanging gardens that exuded aromas of sage and myrrh. At the top, one chamber open to the cosmos showed priests offering incense to a light that gushed from the firmament, as if the boundaries between the sacred and the human had been erased. Suddenly, the vision trembled and fragmented in hundreds of sparks, each one falling like one shooting star. The voice, now closer, spoke clearly, "I raised this tower, and I will show that the word of man can reach the throne of the heavens." Astar felt a shiver run down his spine. His heart raced, mixing fear and ecstasy. Then everything went dark, and she fell to knees on the cold floor of the temple, gasping, tears of emotion wetting your hands. Woke up at dawn, the sky painted in shades of pink. Still dazed, she shook her head and ran her fingertips over the mosaic stones, confirming that it was the same floor-old, no more one vision. Ran back to the Camp Royal, wearing only one thin cloak. The breath accelerated. Climbing onto the improvised platform, struck the bronze staff on the ground to gather advisors and guards. His gaze, filled with urgency, crossed with King Anuk, who frowned the eyebrows upon noticing his state. In the throne tent, the hall was darkening by the morning, but torches were already burning gently. Buran, Merit and Elias were waiting around a low table, covered with drawings and clay containers with clay samples. Astar approached from the throne, and before anyone could ask, told the dream in a trembling voice, detailing the shape of the tower, the garden suspended and the divine call. The king, looking at her with curiosity, gestured for her to continue, while the advisors exchanged glances of surprise. General Buran was the first to speak. Pronounce. "Princess, this vision is inspiring but borders on madness. We touch the divine, we live to hear the wrath of the heavens. We will not forget that they were able of destroying the world with flood." Her voice sounded like a blade against the intentions of Astar. The high priest Elias, with the staff resting on the parchment, he raised the tome of Genesis and read in deep voice. They said, "Let's build for us one city and one tower, whose top reaches to the heavens." The divine answer was to confuse the languages and disperse men. "We should fear the consequences." Merit, noting each argument, concluded, "The military and economic cost will be colossal. We must first ensure that the borders are not violated and that the people do not let themselves blind to grand dreams. Without discipline and order, the work will sink before passing the foundations." His tone was firm, almost dry, contrasting with Astar's emotional vibe. Amram, the architect-poet who had accompanied the princess up to there, surprised of surprise and suddenly rose, approached the throne, held the staff of Astar, and recited verse in ancient Aramaic. "We raise the word in stone, and the voice of man will conquer time." Each brick, carved verse, each step, the path of the breath divine, its song laden with feeling, filled the hall like a breath of hope. "We are children of Noah, lords of the land that was reborn. If we fear the divine wrath divine, how shall we dare to believe in your benevolent silence? This tower is our song in the form of stone." King Anuke rose, supported by the alabaster scepter, made a gesture to silence everyone, and spoke in a measured voice. "Glory or destruction, here is the dilemma we face. If we raise the tower in honor of the Most High, we can attract His grace, but if it is for pride, we run the risk of repeating the ruin of Antau." He looked at Astar and Amran, then at Buran and Elias, pondering every word. "I need tangible proof of faith before decide. Tomorrow collect offerings at Noah's temple. If the waters of the river rise without warning, we will know that the sky accepts us. Otherwise, we will have to rein in our ambitions." Absolute silence fell over the court. The princess and the poet exchanged a brief look of relief. The disgruntled advisors withdrew to fulfill the royal order. In the outer corridor, torches crackled the cold wind. Astar tightened Amran's arm, and Amran murmured, "The dream remains alive. Tomorrow, we will see the verdict of the gods." He smiled, confident. Thus, the debate came to an end. Clash of human voices as powerful as the call divine, that on the previous night will illuminate the forgotten temple. When the first foundations of the Tower of Babel began to emerge over the plain and the marsh, no one could foresee how far the dream of touching the sky would turn into trial. That work, conceived under divine auspices and governed by the passion of first princess, engineer and poet architect, soon she would find herself besieged by almost invisible enemies. The own nature, human fragility, and the inexorable disagreement between men and women driven by diverse ambitions. The day brightened with heavy silence over Babel. The day brightened with heavy silence over Babel. Princess Astar, still under the effect of one bad night's sleep, gathered executors, foremen and messengers to outline new transportation routes. The goal was twofold: discover superior quality clay veins to clay reddish already in use and locate reserves of cedar that could withstand the weight of the spiral ramps. Mounted on a spirited steed of rustic saddle rustic, Astar led one caravan of 60 wagons, pulled by strong oxen yokes. Each cart brought piece, picks, axes, measuring tools and water jugs water. Behind her, Amram was walking with one papyrus clipboard, noting coordinates, depths and the relative purity of each soil sample. Soil. The newly opened roads, full of loose stones and fallen trunks, were a hassle. In a marshy stretch, one cartwheel sank to the height of the axle, forcing men to dig around the tomb to redistribute the weight. The princess ordered that they raise temporary wooden bridges, transversely driven trunks to the mud, forming unstable but passable board. The carts were crossing, groaning, creaking, while the damp dust stuck to the faces of the drivers. At the edge of the road, wildflowers offered brief relief to the eye but soon gave way to puddles, where amphibians croaked incessantly. On the third morning, the group reached the canyon of rust-colored walls, whose slopes revealed rows of lead clay, silky and free of cracks. Astar got down from the carts to examine the interior of one crack, larger than 7 men lined up. With the tip of the staff, measured the humidity and the grain size of the clay, while the foreman measures the width of the trench. "This is the clay we need," she murmured, her eyes shining. Amram, kneeling, made an improvised poem in Aramaic, praise to the reserve hidden by the earth. In the bowels of the world the clay sleeps pure as divine intention. In your hands it flourishes and raises the stone chant that remembers the man. Meanwhile, the caravan of woodcutters was advancing to the north, under the leadership of Urim, the master carpenter. He led the group to a cedar grove centenarians, whose crowns disappeared in the mist morning. At each languid branch, the resinous smell filled the air, and nocturnal moths still hovered the top of the trunks. The bronze axes sounded in measured rhythms, but required superhuman effort. With each blow, the lumberjacks took turns to avoid cramps and exhaustion. When the trunk finally gave way, wooden creaks broke in the air, spreading shards sharp on the ground covered with dry needles. Hurin ordered teams of porters to lower each log down the hill, tying them with hemp ropes and leather guides, leather to the walls of the camp main. After 9 days, the caravan returned to Babel. Hundreds of bales of clay and dozens of cedar logs were lined up next to the foundation pit. Merritt, a scribe, compared the quantities with the spreadsheets. There was material to make 15,000 bricks and support ramps of up to 6 meters in height, but the wood would only be enough for half of the scaffolding planned. The princess, exhausted, gathered the advisors in a tent lit by torches. The discussion dragged on until dawn. Merritt proposed to buy wood in neighboring regions, neighboring at a price of 15 days' delay. Buren indicated prisoners of war as an alternative to reduce wood consumption. By the way, recommended replacement partial by treated salguero. Astar, pondering, ordered the third survey of cedar, this time to the southeast, where accounts of ancient caravans mentioned a clearing full of twisted trunks. Back at the camp, Amram and Astar dedicated themselves to the next great challenge: allow the lifting of stone blocks that weighed up to 150 pounds. On the flooded ground, raise the first spiral ramp prototype, supported by cedar beams and willow slats, willow well fastened. Cast bronze pulleys designed by Astar spun with braided hemp ropes, while wooden sleds, partially looked at with resin, slid along the tracks. Each component was tested exhaustively. Angles of 0 DEO, which Guinzido, 18 Bravos, and up to 20 Brian were tested, until one inclination revealed the best compromise between human effort, and continuous elevation. The clay molds mixed with straw and oven ashes generated bricks that dried in the sun on mats of rushes. At each solemnity of settlement of the inaugural brick, there was a brief ceremony. The high priest, Elias, was reciting one blessing. Amram was chanting verse and Astar moved chisel on the block, engraving in it dates and symbols of creation. But behind the ritual, anew was germinating threat. The fever began to afflict workers who were working in the shade of the scaffolding. Meret's records reported cases of dysentery, typhoid fever and malaria, originated in stagnant water puddles, breeding grounds of voracious mosquitoes. The resting huts transformed in infirmaries. Clay urns were boiling with homemade remedies, elderberry decoctions, honey ointments and eucalyptus leaves. Miriam, a healer priestess, was walking with a wooden staff carved in a spiral, applying compresses of nutmeg crust and incensing myrrh eyes to purify the body and the spirit. Still, the high mortality rates remained. Young lives succumbed to delusions, convulsions and hemorrhages. The uncertainty invaded the camp. Workers were napping in their tents, murmuring that the tower would attract ancient plagues, as if each brick raised against it the wrath of Yahweh. The princess, the Tanita, ordered the construction of a quarantine sector. 10 isolated tents, arranged in a circle, watered by juniper smoke, to repel insects. Camp outcasts would wake, watching at night, administering thin broth of cooked grains and water with a thread of vinegar, in the hope to curb excessive hydration. Astar wrote letters to King Yanuk, begging for more provisions, imported herbs from Haran, straw bed modules and medical reinforcements. Amran, for his part, composed a song of hope that echoed through the muddy corridors. In wounded flesh the stone flourishes, in sweat and tears the tower grows, that the name of the just heals the wound and echo the foundation of our life. Even so, the disease continued insidious. Workers refused to work, empty of courage. Merit headlines reported a drop of 40% in production rate. Some fearful artisans called for the suspension total of the work until swampy areas were drained, proposal that Merit labeled as unrealistic and Buren as complicit with weakness. A tension between health and productivity threatened to break the initial pact. Raising the tower would cost lives, but stopping would mean destroy the hope of union. When the tower reached 10 meters in height, the sky turned against the venture. First came low, restless clouds that covered the zenith and announced off-season rains. Cutting winds swept through the camp, tearing shelter tarps and making the beams sway as if they were crying in protest. Nightstorm knocked down entire scaffolding, dragging them downhill, while hammers and chisels fell into strident stews. The supply channel overflowed, invading the foundation pit and leading to collapse of recently launched steps. In the silence that followed, workers emerged from beneath the soft earth, exhausted, profaning songs of lament. But it was the series of collective dreams that captivated the camp. In the same dawn, dozens of workers reported identical nightmares. The tower growing until it touches clouds loaded, shattering by its own mass and burying villages. Some swore they had heard voices calling for the dispersal, other unknown languages cutting your throat. When they woke up, glassy eyes stared into the void. Trembling hands rested on the shoulders of companions, begging for safety. Fearing superstition, Astar summoned one vigil of penance in the Temple of Noah, near the main canal. Under columns partially noisy, priests and artisans marched in procession, waving torches of incense and chanting psalms of repentance. Elias read aloud, "Let us go down and confuse there his language, so that they do not understand the language of each other." The reading, intended to warn against the sin of pride, sounded like a veiled threat. Still, some workers raised inaudible prayers, scraping the ground with their nails while others slipped out of the temple, restless, as if the very sacred space pulsed with fury. As storms intensified, lightning scored the horizon with almost sacrilegious violence. Nightly thunders made the foundations vibrate, and stone hammers were falling from broken scaffolds. The ground shook in short waves, suggesting underground movements. Meret, noting with trembling hands, displayed graphs of production that plummeted with each rain. With each flood, part of the built wall disappeared under mud. Workers, frightened, crying, embraced, seeing in the destruction, omen of punishment, divine. In this climate of despair, social schisms flourished. Veteran masons, whose hands knew the cracks of the clay, complained the increase in working hours and the lack of extra salaries. "We work to the marrow and the king toasts in the palace," murmured Rami, leader of the blockers. He gathered 20 companions in the shadow of scaffolding and declared a silent strike, refusing to lift more than 5 bricks per day. The answer came immediately. Buren ordered that 2 foremen replace Rami for slaves captured at the borders, willing to impose strict measures. Amran tried to mediate the crisis. He sat down with Rami, Hurin, and some officers and spoke with the eloquence of poet. If the stone is our song, then let each voice sing in harmony. If each hammer blow is a verse that does not let echo the dissonance, proposed bonuses in scented oil, one weekly festivity with bread and wine for all the workers, and staggered shifts that respected work and rest cycles. But in the tents of the court, Meret considered the idea financially irresponsible. Buran called her capitulation in the face of weakness. Only Elias defended the negotiation, arguing that the soul of the worker is as sacred as the altar of the temple. The next day, at the break of dawn, the workers gathered in front of the main pit. Foreman handed them the king's orders to King to double the construction pace until reaching 18 meters before the next festival lunar. Uncontained, many raised their hands in protest. Others, ashamed, just lowered their gaze. The princess, feeling the explosion of discontent, climbed to the podium and spoke with a firm voice. "We do not preach martyrdom here, but glory shared. We do not raise this tower to crush bodies, but to elevate to crush bodies, but to raise the unified voice of our people." Their words received hesitant applause but did not appease attention. Injured workers returned to the improvised shacks to collect members burst. Nobles tightened the reins of the treasury, promising to reduce provisions to rebellious families. When the tower reached 19 meters, the ruin was decreed not by a single act, but for details that replicated like viruses social. Orders written on wet papyrus, brought by the rain, became illegible. Foremen, seeking clarity, rewrote the memory instructions, but they caused dangerous exchanges. Increased layers of 5 bricks turned into increasing layers of 15. Check joining modes turned to ignore joint damage. With each distortion, weak bricks were laid, causing cracks and partial collapses of sections already erected. In a critical episode, one delegation of artisans from Haran, brought to share techniques, special techniques of clay cooking, was poorly received. Royal Guard soldiers, suspicious of foreigners, prevented their entry into the construction site, accusing them of poisoning the tremor of the columns. In retaliation, the masters of Haran abandoned the camp, taking with them hardening formulas mix that could save part of the construction. Finally, the great break occurred on a cloudless morning, but of gloomy moods. Under the pale sun, the workers refused to climb the scaffolding. Rami, Erector's spokesperson, proclaimed that without security guarantees would not help to raise more brick. Meret informed the king that production fell at 25% of the forecasted. Buran demanded the arrest of Rami and his followers. Elias pleaded for more outcry to God. Asther of Knees begged for unity, but his appeals sounded useless. With a dry snap, the chain that supported part of the central scaffolding broke. One column of clay and stone fell over the ditch, dragging beams, supports, and dozens of intact dreams. The scream rose, eyes staring into the abyss, fearing that it would widen. The tower, until then a symbol of one voice unique, lay in ruins. Workers ran away. Nobles shut themselves in their tents. Priests chanted laments. And over the field hovered more eloquent silence than 1,000 songs. The dream had shattered, and with it the superb human voices were cast into dispersion. In the first days after the roar that shook part of the tower, the Babel camp became bored of intrigues. Military officials led by Buran argued that the work had been conceived also as a fortress against threats external. His heralds were circulating through the tents, claiming that without reinforcements, more wood, bronze nails, strong ropes, the borders would remain defenseless. Simultaneously, artisans like Hurin and Rami raised their voices in night assemblies. Each log diverted from the ramps decreased the chance of the tower withstand the elements and the very passage of time. Gathered under the central pavilion, Meret and Elias were trying to mediate the impasse. A scribe wrote on papyrus the quantities consumed, while the high priest evoked prayers for the sacred work was not profaned by ambitions smaller. "The stone speaks," said Elias in voice loud, "but only gains strength when there is no hand that robs him of sustenance." Buran replied, pointing to banners worn by the winds of the east. "Whoever does not place a sword next to the stone will have the wall invaded." And under this climate of mixed accusations, bronze saws borrowed to the barracks and ox carts that were supposed to deliver cedar to the yard disappeared without a trace. Meanwhile, small groups of foremen began to gather in shaded corners, exchanging favors. Lumberjacks received extra rations in exchange for firewood for barracks bonfires. Foremen exchanged hemp ropes for discounts on provisions. From within these invisible barriers, the factions were spreading rumors of mutual betrayal. Artisans said that the king's officials were planning to abandon the tower without warning. Military claimed that carpenters kept secrets of brick manufacturing that could yield profits outside the actual project. The trust that once kept all voices united leaned to the wind of distrust. Amidst these rumors, a man with calm gaze and silent steps, known only as Shalom, the traveler of Harang, pretending to be a gem cutter, will present to Hurin on the day when the first ramps reached 10 meters. Dressed in a simple cloak, but carried a case of refined tools. In a short time, your ability to smooth marble surfaces dedicated to facade ornaments earned you the trust of the craftsman. Nobody suspected that, underneath the leather apron, Shalom kept encrypted papyri, site maps and instructions for night messengers. In the stillness of the nights, he was getting lost in scaffolding corridors and accessing the depot main tool. Ali surreptitiously photographed, withdrawing the actual stock, encoded how many grinding pestles, how many bronze pulleys, and what the schedule exact delivery of the following loads. Each fragment of information was transmitted by messengers, disguised as woodcutters that returned to Aram-Naharain with faithful reports. The true Shalom's purpose was to weaken the tower from within inside, so that in case of conflict, the kingdom neighbor would find only ruin and mud when crossing a plain. Shalom designed small floors, suggested that ropes be replaced by branches of willow less resistant, underestimated the ideal angle of the ramps, recommended the use of a more oily type of oil to lubricate pulleys. Each wrong advice brought delay, silent, almost imperceptible, and at the same time messages that reinforced the thesis that Babel could not sustain itself without help external. Some artisans, suspicious, noted brittle, but they were led to believe that the culprit was the very natural wear, feeding the disunity internal. On a clear sky, dawn clear, when the tower had reached 27 meters, deafening scream echoed from the north sector. The body of Azariel, the most talented bas-relief sculptor, was found stretched out on unfinished blocks. Dagger embedded in the chest gleamed under the fallen torch fallen at your side. The silence that followed was followed. The discovery was so dense that even the hammers ceased their rhythm. Azariel was loved by all. His ability to engrave protection symbols on the stones was considered miraculous. Astar, alerted by the guards, ran to the location accompanied by Merit and Elias. The flower bed turned into a scene of improvised inquisition. Each witness was obligatorily heard. Helper who brought bags of lime, foreman who monitored the baking of the bricks, soldier stationed at the gate. The versions varied. Some said to have seen sinister shadows, others claimed having heard barking of loose dogs. There were those who whispered having heard Shalom speaking in ancient Aramaic with a guard officer. The dagger, they discovered, was not of local forge, but imported, and the papyrus torn underneath the blade came from 2 scrolls ciphered that the traveler carried. The death of Azariel ignited accusations. Artisans attributed the crime to vengeful generals. The army saw in it an act of sabotage created by adversaries clandestine. Hurin, with tearful eyes, gathered master masons and threatened to suspend all the ornamental work if the murderer was not delivered. The tension escalated, for the construction of reliefs and inscriptions sacred was the main ritual that guaranteed the blessing of Elijah over the tower. Without it believed, the work would lose its divine support. Determined to contain the chaos, Asta ordered court improvised in the foundation pit, under one scarlet tarpaulin, called jurors composed of 4 artisans, 4 soldiers, and 3 priests. Each side presented its evidence. Merethi presented records of material withdrawal. Elias brought fragments of papyrus with prayers inscribed around symbols of death. Buram showed correspondence with the barracks requesting instruments precision cutting. The lieutenant in charge of the vexed northern sector was the first to testify. Among the witnesses, notes emerged against Shalom. 2 lumberjacks declared to have seen in his pocket small rolls of papyrus. Another said that the traveler had forgotten 1 miniature of dagger, supposedly present at the crime scene. Pressured, the spy tried to escape, claiming memory loss. But Asthar insisted on confronting him with testimonies and route maps, revealing one network of messengers that transported information to Aram-Naharaim. With each question, Shalom contradicted himself, delivering the microcosm of his conspiracy before the astonished eyes of those present. In the end, the court declared Shalom guilty of espionage and conspiracy to murder. His possessions were burned in the square public, their sculpture techniques rejected as profane. The spy was tied to one central column of the tower, exposed to shocks of light and downpours of rain until admitting all the names involved. Baran would suffer salary cuts and loss of patent if she could not replace all the diverted material. Merite, exhausted, took over the new inspection department of resources with reliable guards. Even so, the upheaval had left deep wounds. Artisans connected symbols of death, known of Azariel, to excerpts of the verses of Amran. They believed that the guilty architect-poet would have instigated the crime. His early mornings turned into sleepless nights, tracing verses of regret. By the way, for its part, dedicated itself to new purification rituals, but the prayers no longer found echo in the soaked foundations. The exposed cedar columns to the division internal began to creak more frequently, as if the tower itself lamented the betrayals. And while Babel resumed the work under glances suspicious, rumors of new intrigues circulated along the paths that connected the plain to the neighboring kingdoms. No one knew if the tower would withstand not only the storms and the disease, but the fragility of human alliances, now unraveled by accomplices and traitors. On the 8th night after the trial of Shalom, the firmament opened in an unprecedented spectacle. 2 moons appeared in the sky, one of hue silver crowned by tender halo blue, and another red, pulsing like a live ember. The edges of the horizon turned purple, and each breath night seemed to resonate in the void between the 2 spheres. It was almost a mystery for wise men and commoners. Constellators murmured that Selene would divide into wrath and compassion, while astrologers calculated that the phenomenon did not occur since time immemorial. At the same time, one meteor shower began to tear through the upper layers of the atmosphere, sudden flash culminating in incandescent trails, each burning fragment scratched at night, falling towards the plain as a preamble of omens. At the camp, the eyes turned to the sky in commotion. Children raised their arms trying to touch that twin moonlight twin. Workers set aside their tools, impressed the ruby glow and the distant roar of meteors distant. Until the bustle of the carts crossing ramps decreased, the sound of the cosmo emerged, insistent. Some swore they could hear, mixed with the howling of the wind, whispers unknown, as if the universe were calling men and gods to account. At dawn, the torches went out of their own accord, and silence funeral took over the flowerbed. Artisans whispered that it was the silence of the souls, announcing punishment divine. Priests went to the papyrus of Noah and recorded the phenomenon alongside the sacred calendar. Elias summoned everyone to a one assembly in the improvised temple. There, he urged the people to offer sacrifices of grain and incense of myrrh to appease the fury of Selene. Merit, always pragmatic, noted in her scrolls exact times of appearance of the duplicated moons and the frequency of the meteor shower, compared with ancient eclipses, but did not find precedence in the archive royal. Knew that without one clear interpretation, superstitions would spread and undermine the morale of the workers. Therefore, it arose the need to speak out. They organized one vigil of 24 hours, aimed at gathering observations and offer bread and water to those who passed cold. In the tents the rumor had grown. Some claimed to have seen shadows flying among the rocks at nightfall, others that the torches flickered as if taken by invisible hands. The high priest, wrapped in scarlet robes, erected improvised altars and read oracles ancient, begging for mercy. But in Asta's voice was heard grave tone of alert. "We will not allow fear to corrode the work of so many," she said, even though the hands trembled when holding the ebony staff. Among the most affected by the phenomenon was one newly arrived slave named Anna. She was 12 years old and had arrived by the supply caravan. Supplies. Of looking curious, slept little and dreamed a lot. On the night when the double moons appeared, woke up startled, breathing with difficulty. His frail body trembled, his fists clenched as if they wanted to grab something invisible. Maternal hands, curious, caressed him the hair, but she murmured, "They sing, attentive ears. They will hear songs of cracked stone." The next morning, the NA was brought to the Astar Commission by trusted guard. Under the main tent, revealed details of his dreams. I saw 2 priestesses chanting chants inside the tower, and the ground vibrated like a wounded heart. Then I saw Greek flames winding around the pillars, and choir of distant voices crying dissolved vanity. Their black eyes sparkled, while described the echo of metal drums, as if each hammer blow of the construction reverberated in two simultaneous frequencies. Astar, Elias, and Meret exchanged worried glances. They remembered the accounts of Azariel that spoke of disturbing dreams before the murder. Now that seemed like a link, omens in the sky and premonitions of one slave child. Even skeptical, Merete noted every word, recording time and intensity of dreams, seeking correlation with the lunar cycle and the precipitation of meteors. The high priest, in turn, interpreted the dreams as visions of restless spirit, perhaps that of Azariel crying out for justice. Although young and silent, the voices of Anar echoed through the corridors of camp. Clay loaders, carpenters, and welders began to whisper. Is she an oracle from above? Some human anthills formed next to the tent of the princess, eager to hear more. Astar had to intervene to contain the curious, organized night study groups in which Anar would be protected while recounting her dreams, and priests would record probable meanings. To shape the widespread fear, Astar decreed official vigil at the tower during all the nights when the moon's twin moons were visible. They armed themselves, flashes of torches on temporary terraces, and observation teams' observation noted every change in the sky and any unexpected sound. Carpenters raised poles to support bronze bells that, if touched by wind or tremor, would sound like an immediate alert. On the first night of vigil, the bells vibrated to the sound of sudden wind. Some workers, exhausted, refused to climb the ramps. Others gathered in circles, disturbance reflected in Anna's mind, who felt one stone pain in the temple. Meret, covered in scrolls, noted the coordinates of each chime and compared with the moment when a meteorite scratched the sky. Elias, wrapped in prayers, wielded frankincense incense, seeking to appease the spirits that, according to him, were stirring in the firmament. At each dawn, the community returned to work under the weight of suspicious looks. Masons were hitting hammers in a slower rhythm, as if they were respecting a sacred pause. If they respected one sacred pause. Lumberjacks hesitated to descend logs after the fall of the night, fearing that the woodcutting awakened celestial furies. Astar, torn between fulfilling the schedule and the eminent signs, called for advice urgent. Meret insisted that the observations should continue, while on the other hand defended expiation festival in the central yard. The phenomenon of the moon's double lasted for 7 nights, the meteor shower for 3. When the celestial spheres finally returned to their unique orbits, the camp remained parched, with eyes still turned upwards. The voices of Anar silenced, but the memory of the stone songs remained alive in the hearts. However, something had changed. The tower was not just a human work, but a meeting point between the visible and the invisible, and in Babel they now knew that touching the sky meant hear your whispers, sparkling jewels alert against the ambition that as not yet had ceased to grow in the ethereal altitudes, where clouds gather in columns of light silver, rose substanceless hall, supported by arches of mist and arches of lightning. There gathered the heavenly hosts, winged beings whose wings were filaments of brightness, shimmering in hues of pearl and amber. Each movement shook the air with reverberations musical, and each gaze conveyed centuries of wisdom. The ground, made of dew condensed, resonated under the steps of ancient archangels, whose little voices echoed in an endless choir. In the center, that immaterial space dominated one blue crystal throne, sculpted by the very essence of Aurora. To its turn, arranged in a semicircle, were 5 smaller chairs, reserved for those who would take an active part in the judgment of human destiny. Rays of light formed filaments luminous that oscillated as the debate gained momentum. The assembly, composed of countless legions of cherubim, seraphim, and thrones, awaits solemnly the word of the celestial princes. Will he be faithful, the custodian of the flames? He rose first. Her voice was warm like the glow of embers, and the clouds around trembled slightly. Despite the fervor that moves men to raise towers, we saw that pride has already stained every stone. 2 moons and meteors painted the sky with judgment. If we allow them to go without breaks, they will attract upon themselves the ruin of punishment lived by Babel. The destruction, partial although painful, is the measure by which how the human soul learns to moderation. Your argument found resonance in Raquel, the judge of order, that snapped his fingers and added, "Justice is not done without balance nor total abandonment that would condemn innocence nor indulgence full, that new generality arrogance. We must weave a gentle break, reminder of the divine that makes them hesitate, but without crushing the breath of hope. When the lectern flickered in a deep purple tone, deep Zadkiel, the angel of mercy, raised his pen of light and spoke calmly, persuasive. Compassion is not weakness, but the forge that strengthens. We do not want to just teach the lesson, but to offer man the chance to redeem. Let's send breath of melody, soft song that penetrates hearts and make heard in the soul the murmur of our presence. That mercy be the beacon that lights your steps. While Zadkiel's speech still vibrated in the air, Uriel, the silent observer, opened its wings in a gesture that made shine each feather with opal tones. I received visions of human souls. One young slave, Mary, captures sounds of metal and singing in dreams. Priests and workers pray with trembling hands. There is fear, but there is also genuine humility. Genuine. Your heart is open. It is for her and for so many others that we should, before everything, to guarantee the freedom of choice, honoring the free will. Young voices, archangels with wings delicate, whispered in leather, to send ethereal messenger, one raga of wind or chord that triumphs in silence. But be careful. If we touch too much, let us subvert the mystery and take the place of man in his own way. The tension thickened when the hall entire remained in silent waiting. The chair shone one last time, reflecting all the colors discussed: the red of justice, the purple of doubt, the amber of compassion. Finally, Raquel tilted her head and pronounced the resolution, that free will be preserved. But we sent one note, melody fragment recorded in the silence of souls, that will echo on the next night of 2 moons. If after this sign the men continue in pride, then the severest justice will be decreed. The verdict was inscribed on a luminous parchment, carried by the breeze to the crevices of matter. As it disperses in shimmering rays, the hall mystical murmurs hymn of exaltation and farewell. Each angel raised an arm of terror and fright, becoming a point of light to dissolving in the immensity. In the depths of the plain below, Mary fell asleep again, and the melody, soft, serious, like the serene pulse of one string of harp, reached her bones. She woke up with her eyes watery eyes, knowing that the divine breath had reached your name. In the silence of the construction site of Babel, a new chapter was being written, where compassion and the lesson would unite in a single chord, ready to seal the fate of the tower and of its builders. When the firm melody, sung by the heavenly voices, crossed the night silence, Babel awoke in a whirlwind of screams and echoes. Even before dawn, workers appeared in the rows of scaffolding like ants enraged, each repeating instructions disconnected. Raise the beam, release the mooring, turn the block, do not cut the rope. The words exploded like sparks in a powder keg. Gunpowder, mixing local dialects, stutters of fear and orders, imperative of foremen astonished. At the edges of the great ditch, the recently raised section collapsed with a dull roar. The shattering of loose stones reacted to the screams. The echo brought answers out of sync, making each command impossible to discern. To the side, the clay columns creak, as if they were lamenting the human doubt. On the other hand, watchmen on top of the scaffolding sway, lost between the stability that still remains and the fall imminent. In the center of chaos, Asta raised the royal standard and brandished the bell of bronze, trying to impose order. Attention, mark the signs, tighten the ropes, but your own words were diluted in the clamor. The shock of the bell reverberated in the eardrums, already dazzled by the shouts of men. Gust of wind, perhaps the breath divine, infiltrated between the beams and diverted the ropes, making the platform sway violently. Buran, the commander, ran among soldiers with raised spears. Each order came from their lips with voice firm, but soon got mixed up with the voices noisy of the workers. Protect the perimeter, gather the torches, advance the south ramp. None of this echoed in the rifles and shields, for the guards, without clarity, hesitated between following orders and seeking shelter against one threat they could not name. In the shed of Meret, stacks of papyrus flew like autumn leaves autumn. She was trying to record the sequence of events using charcoal to note each comma of the turmoil, but as the notes piled up, his hand trembled and the words became jumbled. North block, tremors, nomenclature indecipherable. The cord broke. When one slab fell on the front door entry, Meret was designed against one table, risking losing the entire record of that chaotic morning. Amram, the poet-architect, climbed on a firm block, and began to recite verses intended to calm the spirits. Oh, cries cutting, silence that the harmony of man returns to the foundation, but her voice still sweet, diluted in a dialogue plural of languages and mechanical urgencies. At each stanza, hammer fell, support was tilting, cobblestone was running down the hill. Abra, exasperated, tried to resume the rhyme, but chaos invaded so completely that his words sounded like mere noises of winds. Elias, the high priest, raised the censer loaded with sacred embers, spinning gestures of purification. I pleaded with the heavens to cease the turmoil, that the angels remove the veil of the thunder, that the tower regain its voice, but the earthly whirlwind seemed to respond to him with irritated laughter. Ashes flew between the beams, mixing to the clouds of dust, and the priest had to move away to avoid being hit by clay fragments and broken ropes. Meanwhile, Mary, the young slave who had dreamed of the chant divine, ran amidst the conflict. He had in his hands a small wooden drum, heritage of his homeland, and beat rhythm disconnected, trying to remember the soft melody he had heard. Each beat, however, was muffled by the shards of voices and tools. Even so, her head throbbed with echoes of that breath, and with each attempt to reproduce the chant felt a shiver. I knew that if I could rescue the melodic line, could calm everyone. From above, Hurin observed through the cracks of the wallstone and shouted instructions to support architects of support. Reinforce the joint, lower the angle of the beam, cut the notch. But the base, already weakened, trembled. Now it seemed to waver. Now it was recovering, as if the tower were one living creature fighting against the agony of human pride. The men of Urim, confused, looked at each other, not knowing whom to obey. The foreman, who shouted in a rough language, or to the architect, who gestured in rudimentary Latin. Rami, the master of mortars, appeared with buckets of lime, ready to plaster the cracks. However, he got confused with the officer's shrill shout. Instead of throwing the mixture over the main trunk, threw it in the face of the lumberjack who, passing, triggering a second panic outbreak. Lumberjacks ran, spread torches, and sparks jumped over the oil cans stored for the evening. The scenes were mixing in a choreography chaotic. Beams creaked, soldiers were retreating, foremen wielded whips to impose discipline, women carried the wounded beyond the line of block fire flying. In the midst of that pandemonium, each protagonist sought regain the thread of voice that was lost. Astar was trying once more to raise the bell. Buran was trying to gather at least 10 guards. Merit was collecting flyers that insisted on escaping from your hands. Amram recited verses mystical, in fact gestured prayers. Hurim marked angles, and Mary hammered nervously the drum. The breaking point came when section entire scaffold collapsed, sending people jolting into the pit. Collective shout echoed, and for one fraction of second, time seemed to throb. The voices remained in suspended. The shovel stopped in the air, the eyes met. So again the orders fragmented, and the tower, a living reflection of the confusion, groaned in protest, announcing that the next collapse would not be partial. The moment of calm lost, drawn on each face the same expression, the swift triumph of chaos when words lose meaning, and only the sinister laughter of ruin remains. When the last sparks of chaos went out between dust and trembling beams, rose heavy silence in the ancient garden. The rising sun tinged the remnants with gold of twisted scaffolding, while each group gathered for the farewell. There was a tremor on the lips of those who were leaving. Silent hugs, whispered promises, and gazes turned to the unfinished tower. Now there is only one silhouette fragile against the sky. Princess Astar sounded the starting signal in a poor little bell pour, and the caravan set out on the march, each one guided by leader and by the hope of a new beginning. Buran led his soldiers towards the northern mountains, where the eternal snow promised fortress and isolation. The smell of hot iron and coal covered the regret of having diverted wood and nails. Now they would require firm stone walls, reinforcing ancient ruins of past wars. At each step, Buran repeated to the men, "Protect the legacy, but do not forget the lesson of ambition." When the paths narrowed and the wind became sharper, glimpses of the tower far below emerged amidst the low clouds, reminding them that the true defense is in unity, not just in steel. With its scribes and masters of papyrus, Meret wandered through the western forest, where centenary trunks kept freshness and shaded paths. There they would establish a traveling library, housed in carved carts with symbols of Azariel, the sculptor murdered. Every night, in the light of oil lamps, oil-copied records of King Anuk, ancient decrees and songs of nomads. Meret knew that saving the memory of Babel was preserve the soul of the empire. When they reached a virgin clearing, set up white fabric tents, and a round of bonfires, they promised register each smile and each sadness thereon from then on. Amran went alone to the east, not among incandescent dunes, but through the plains where the wind eastern sang secrets of stone. Their destiny was hermits of isolated monastery, guardians of architectural techniques to raise towers that would withstand earthquakes. To each village that crossed composed new verses, hymns to the clay that learns with the hands of men. At night, slept under the stars, dreaming of columns that would not bend to the pride, but if they rose in humility. In your chest, carried only brush, handful of pigments, and the certainty that day could redesign the future. Princess Astara accepted the advice of the young slave Mary and headed south, where green hills and vineyards invited to dialogue. In each village held public hearings under ancient oaks millennial, regaining the trust of peasants and artisans. Mary, now interpreter of dreams, translated omens into justice guidelines. The heavens demand balance, said, and a star decreed pardons and reparations. Under the mild heat, smiles appeared. Under the torches at dusk, stories of reconciliation emerged. At each stop, the caravan gained new followers, blacksmiths, poets, even ancient soldiers repentant. At the great crossroads, the routes of Buran Meret, Amram and Astar crossed for moments. Messenger of Buran offered shelter to the scribes of Meret. Amran shared wind songs with Mary. Astar sent supplies to the blacksmiths of the north, but the journey's logo resumed their solitude. Each pursued one distinct mission. Some groups ventured through salty deserts, others navigated mighty rivers on improvised rafts. The dust of the roads mixed with laughter and tears, reminding everyone that, even scattered, still belonged a single story. 40 days later, each leader drove stakes into firm ground. Buran built a defensive outpost next to icy cliffs, illuminated by red torches. Meret raised one office between carvalhos, where scrolls floated like autumn leaves. Amran established workshops in the plain east, shaping stones with techniques ancestral. Astar established a traveling court, judging disputes under flowery pills. Mary, now spiritual guide, gathered collective dreams and sang songs of hope before each dawn. Each place exuded the purpose of rebuild, not just towers, but hearts. On a clear morning, everyone looked at the point where the flower bed was born. There in the distance, the tower stood upright until the middle of the dream, surrounded by empty scaffolding. Her silhouette was remembered against the sky as an immortal reminder. Work unfinished, suspended hope. The wind that descended from the mountains brought distant echo of harp and soft voice, perhaps the last whisper of the angels, reminding that, for each construction, there is a price and one lesson. It was the end of one era and the beginning of another. Each leader raised his gaze and felt in the breeze the invitation to return day to the construction site. For the tower, unfinished, it was not just the end of one journey, but the starting point of infinite possibilities. Between ruins and dreams, the dispersion of the tribe sealed outcome and, at the same time, opened various paths. The sun embraced those who departed and illuminated the silhouette of the tower. Eternal promise that while there are those who dream, no work will truly be completed.